Mara Ahmed is an interdisciplinary artist and an activist filmmaker based in Long Island, New York. She was educated in Belgium, Pakistan, and the United States. Her documentary films have been broadcast on PBS and screened at film festivals across the world. Mara is interested in dialogue across both physical and psychological boundaries. In 2017, she gave a TEDx talk about the meaning of borders and nationalism entitled The Edges That Blur. She's now working on her fourth film, The Injured Body, a documentary about racism in America that focuses exclusively on the voices of women of color. Her production company is Neelam Films. Mara helped create the Witness Palestine Film Festival in 2012. Thank you, Mara.
Salam, everyone. Thank you to the Witness Palestine Film Festival for inviting me to be here today. And thank you, Link, for the technical support and for introducing me. I'm honored to interview our two guests. But before we start, I'd like to tell you about where I'm joining you from. So my pronouns are she, her, and I come to you from Lake Ronkonkoma, which means the boundary fishing place in the Algonquin language. The lake acted as a natural boundary between lands occupied by 4 indigenous communities. And these communities are the Nissequogue, the Setauket, the Secatoag, and the Onkichog. It's imperative to acknowledge these communities and the 13 tribes that form Long Island, their elders, both past and present, and future generations. The United States is a settler colony. And so when we critique racism, colonialism, and imperialism, we must commit to dismantling such exclusions and erasures right here at home and acknowledge our own complicity in these systems. We should also support anti-racist, anti-colonial struggles happening in other parts of the world, most urgently in Palestine. Let me introduce our guests to everyone before we start our conversation. Mats Grorud is a film director and animator from Norway. He's previously directed 2 short films and has worked as an animator on several films, documentaries, and music videos. During his childhood, his mother worked as a nurse in refugee camps in Lebanon. In the 1990s, Mats studied at the American University of Beirut while working as an English and animation teacher in the Burj el Barjaneh refugee camp. Based on testimonies of the refugees and his own experiences, he wrote the script for and directed his first feature-length film, The Tower. The film premiered in 2018. It has been screened at 200 international film festivals all over the world and won numerous awards. Welcome to Witness Palestine, Mats.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the kind words as well. Yeah.
And then we have Dr. Dina Matar. She is a professor at the School of Oriental and African Studies, or SOAS, in London. Along with teaching and being involved in research, Dr. Matar chairs the Center for Palestine Studies. She researches and writes on politics and communication, memory cultures, narrative and politics, activism, and media. She is the author of What It Means to Be Palestinian, which came out in 2010 and informs some of the stories in The Tower. She's also co-author and editor of several books. Before joining academia, Dr. Matar worked as a journalist and editor in the Middle East, Asia, the UK, and the US. Before I ask any questions, let me tell you that I watched the film a few days ago and was extremely moved by it in ways that I had not expected. And I was wondering, Mats, if you could tell us the story briefly. There might be some people here today who haven't seen the film yet, but still wanted to be a part of the conversation. So I was wondering if we could get a brief storyline from you.
Yeah, thank you. The story in the film is about this young girl, Palestinian girl, her name's Wardi. She's about 11, and the whole film takes place is one day in her life, and we follow her journey in the house where she lives. She goes from floor to floor in her house, so it's basically a it's a portrait of different, the different parts of what's a Palestinian family, from the 4 different generations in a family, which is the great-grandfather, her grandparents, her mother and father, uncles, aunts, and yeah, finally her. So it's a film where I wanted to show. I lived 1 year in Burj el Barjaneh, so really very much of what I wanted to have in the film was just this kind of to try to show what I learned and understood in the camp, and what fascinated me with so the characters are based on people I know. So I wanted to both say thank you to all my friends for taking care of me while I was living there. At the same time, I wanted to show the world what I saw and what I learned. Which is a different picture of what's who were these refugees, which to me were my friends, and I wanted to show as well as I could the gentleness, my funny friends, the wisdom of all the different things that you get to know as when you have friends. At the same time, I had a mission to try to explain something of the history of the camp, and how people ended up in the camp. So it also starts from 1948 with the Nakba, and you follow the history of this family, starting with the great-grandfather when they had to flee the village in Palestine. And then it's different flashbacks for each generation. And a lot of these flashbacks are based on Dina Matar's work in her book. So it's a film that works on different levels. I lived 1 year in this camp, and I just wanted to make a film that kind of captured as much as possible.
The life in the camp.
Yeah, life in the camp. So yeah.
Well, there were certain things that really stood out to me in the film, and I was wondering if I could just go through them, as an activist and also as a filmmaker. I wanted to talk about some of those things, and I was wondering if maybe I could ask both of you to comment on them specifically or even broadly. So one of the things that I loved was how the English dialogue in the film is voiced by Palestinians, and some of them very famous Palestinians like Mohammed Bakri, Najla Saeed, and Hana Shamoun. And in the film, the English dialogue is laced with Arabic so that it displays some of its rhythms and conversational traits. And it sounds very authentic. It doesn't sound like, it's transplanted from a different culture. And Mats, I was just wondering if that was important to you and how you were able to achieve that authenticity.
Yes, I think, when I was living in the camp, this is the kind of language we spoke. It was kind of a broken English mixed with Arabic. So this was, the language I was used to having with my friends. So this mix of Arabic and that comes from that experience. Something that I also felt, because that would work in animation, was because when you when my friends would speak Arabic and no English as a second language, often I felt that what they would tell me was very poetic, like how my friend would talk about her, how her, that she was dreaming, and at the moment her dreams were perhaps sleeping. Sometimes they were completely dead. But this way of describing her life was to me like, this was the goal that I wanted to have in the film. And I felt that I think in a regular movie, I'm not sure if it would have worked. This kind of, I don't know how to describe it, but it's kind of like heavy in a sense. Like if this was the dialogue in a regular movie, I think people perhaps would have been, wouldn't have liked it. But I think with the puppet, it works really, really nice somehow. So yeah, that was important to me to have. So that was the starting point very much for the way I used, what I remembered from my adult dialogue and when I talked to my friends and my interviews, that I wanted to have these parts in the film. The film is also dubbed. There is an Arabic version with more famous Palestinian actors, and there's a French version as well, and a Norwegian version. So it's dubbed into different languages, which makes it accessible to quite a young audience, which is fantastic. Yeah. So it's screening in schools and a lot of places where it reaches an audience that otherwise wouldn't learn about Palestine. And we're able to talk about film and to talk about the Nakba and the history of the Palestinians in schools, and that's really nice.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Dina, I also had a question for you about language. So you write about communication, narrative, politics, and I was just thinking of the Palestinian poet Fadi Juda. He just wrote recently an article in which he said something like, "I live Palestine in English, but in my heart, Palestine is Arabic. And Palestine in Arabic does not need to explain itself." And so I wanted to ask you, what is the importance of language in liberation struggles, and particularly struggles happening in the global South?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Mara. And I, really privileged to be with you on this panel, and of course with Maps. And of course your work on indigenous populations. Today, by coincidence, I was reading about that and about a lot of work happening in indigenous studies in Canada. And I thought that was quite exciting because it's an area that I know very little about, but obviously it's around the marginalized and the people whose voices we do not hear. So to the question of language, I really think that there are sensibilities and sensitivities to a language that has historical meaning. Language doesn't come out of nowhere. It evolves, but it comes from, I think, particularly Arabic language. It is a language that is somehow reactive to what is happening around. And obviously, when you have a continuous struggle and when you have an issue where people feel they need to talk about it in different ways, there is creativity in the use of language. And so Arabic lends itself to that. There are expressions that are untranslatable into English or any other language. But in general sense, you could translate it, but you cannot really, you might translate one word into a sentence, but without having the historical knowledge and the historical memory, translating into another language might not convey the exact meaning. So language is central. And you were talking about the Global South, and obviously where I work at the School of Oriental and African Studies, it's the expertise and the experience and the lived experience of the languages and the cultures of the regions that we study that matter. And of course, in terms of Palestine, I'm really, kind of fascinated by what Judah was saying, is that, and I'm trying, as you asked me the question, I was trying to interpret it and trying to understand, okay, so how do I interpret that? What does it, how do I respond to it as a Palestinian, to that particular statement that he made? And I do feel it resonates with me, of course, it's, even the word Palestine itself, when you say it, it isn't just a word, it has meanings, it has history, it has experiences, it has remembered feelings, it has feelings of remembered events, if I may say so. And so in a sense, it might mean something more to him and to me than to kind of other people around here. Mats did live that experience, and I must say that the way that he put the characters and the way that he made the characters speak in that film is really you would think that he is actually a Palestinian at heart. So it does feel very, very close. And particularly, he had managed to, even in the English version and the different versions that he used in the different languages, it's a performance. So it wasn't only just language; it's the performance and the language. So the puppets' performance, the kind of interactions and so on, that all made the experience as a whole. So language by itself doesn't work. It needs to be associated with a particular context. It needs, for example, if I say word to the people who are here, it might mean different things to people, but in the context of Palestine, and even the word Palestine does mean something that is related to experiences, to remembered histories, to the struggle, to the liberation, to the constant need to justify yourself that you are a Palestinian. You need to, you have, you're like other people, and you exist just like other people. So I hope I answered your question. It's a very, I must say, it's a very astute question, and I thank you for asking it in this setting.
Thank you so much, Dina. Language is actually something that I'm very interested in myself. And, the whole concept of decolonizing language is also something that I'm interested in because, I come from South Asia and I'm speaking to you in English because we were colonized by the British for 200 years, right? So it's something that interests me also very much. The architecture of the refugee camp is an essential component of the film. It contains the narrative and determines the structure and the aesthetics of the story, with its very dense spatiality. And I was thinking how this could be called the architecture of stolen land, because we see some of this dense spatiality in Gaza as well. Mats, you show us the transformation of the camp as well over time, starting with tents in 1948-49, right after the Nakba, to the present moment. And I was thinking maybe we should look at the actual camp itself. And Link, if you could share the first picture.
Everybody see it okay?
Yeah, I can see it.
Good.
Okay, so this is, one second. Just have information about these pictures. So this is the first picture and it's from Amnesty International. And as you can see, initially the camp was made up of tents. A lot of the refugees came from villages where they led agricultural lives. This is why when their oral histories were recorded, many would start with how they grew corn, wheat, lentils, fruits, and vegetables. In the film, we see this very strong connection to the land through the seeds that people brought with them and that they then planted in Lebanon. And then, Link, can you show us the picture from 2019? This second picture is from 2019, and it shows a view of El Burj and the continued vertical buildup of camp shelters. Burj, by the way, means tower in Arabic. I also wanted to share a little bit of history with you. So Burj el Barjaneh was established in 1949 by the League of Red Cross Societies. The initial camp population was about 3,500 people. The camp was partially destroyed during the Israeli invasion in 1982, and then the Lebanese civil war, which lasted 15 years, from 75 to 1990. Starting in 1969, the camp population expanded rapidly and the urban design changed. Building work was undertaken randomly with no opportunity to solidify the foundations of the camp. Roads became narrow, infrastructure came under stress, and these problems were compounded when new waves of refugees moved in, especially after the crisis in Syria. So now, between 35 to 45,000 people live in the Burj camp, which covers less than 1 square mile. It's just to give you an idea of that spatial density that I was talking about. So Link, if we could go back to the normal view now, that would be great. So Mats, I wanted to ask you how did you build the mini model for the stop motion animation part of the film? It feels very real. You know, we see the narrow alleyways and the clutter and the compactness. the electric wires that are bunched up together everywhere, the graffiti and the posters on the walls, and then the ladders, which I saw were everywhere to connect different towers, but also to connect different levels within the same tower. How did you manage to build that model so well?
Well, I had a very good team that worked with me. We made the film, most of it in France. So there was a really good artists that I worked with. And actually none of them had ever been to Lebanon. So I had lots of videos and lots of pictures, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pictures, because it was really important for me to try to be true to, you know, to what the camp looks like. And not just make, you know, it had to be the camp. It's also with the flashbacks in the film. It was also really important for me to study the photographs from both the camp and from Palestine, and to be really that it works as the film also works as a historic reference to, okay, how did it actually look? You know, how the things are put inside the houses, being put up on the wall, for example. So all these little details were really important to me. Not to just create some generic, you know, what did an actual tent look like in 1948 in this camp? The whole idea for the film started with a story from my good friend Abu Hassan, because his grandfather had a tree which was like just outside their house in the camp, and so Abu Hassan's parents were getting married, they needed to build another floor, and this tree was in the way, and the old man refused. So he would not cut this tree for you know, this was more important than you know, that his kids would have a new flat, or, you know, have their own space in the next floor. So they had to actually wait until he died, and then they did cut the tree, and the house continued to grow. And this story was the starting point for me to because you asked me how, you know, the camp is there, so it's like just a recreation of the camp. But this is a story of how the different generations build these different floors. Was to me, you know, a moving story that described life for people.
Thank you. Dina, I wanted to ask you about the stories that you collected from refugee camps in particular. How were the narratives impacted by the extraordinary conditions in which people have learned to live? So we are used to speaking about refugees and refugee camps many times in terms of stereotypes, but then these are also places of community, and these are also centers of knowledge. And so I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Okay, thank you very much. So for the book that I wrote, and I'm actually now in the process of thinking of a sequel. So for the book I wrote, I interviewed 100 people in Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, Israel, Syria. And so it was a mixture of places and different people from different ages, men, women, and different kind of socio-political status, if you could use that word. So in the camps, what was interesting was the feeling of living, you know, the feeling of, it was that people embraced life and lives in very kind of open ways. I really didn't feel, and perhaps Mats can also comment on this, I didn't feel, particularly in Burj el Barjaneh, that people were inhibited, because you talked about spatiality and you talked about being in a space. And of course, you mentioned Gaza as well. And of course, that also, you could make comparisons between these refugee camps and Gaza as a space that is bordered in a way. And so are these camps. So one has to remember that the context of living in the camps is different. So the people who live in camps, refugee camps in Jordan, and in Syria and in Lebanon have had and continue to have different experiences of existence. And that is because the states, the host countries where they live in, they have different, rules and regulations as to how they can control the camps and continue to control them. So in Jordan, for example, Jordan allowed Palestinians to move in and out, to integrate in society, but it continued to control in different ways. Syria is a different, kind of perspective. Lebanon, in particular, would not give them passports, for example, or citizenship, which meant that they had to find ways of living within the camps, or even if they want to go outside and work outside, they had to come back. So there's multiple levels of control, of space control, and of control in terms of freedom of movement and of integration in the host society. But I think what was very interesting in these camps is two things. One of them is the ways that Palestinians try to recreate in different ways, like what they remember of Palestine. So there was, I know in Burj el Barjaneh, and there was one very poignant story about this old couple whom I interviewed, and they were, they would talk about the plot. There was a green space in the camp that they would go and visit. And it's called turbe in Arabic, and it's a place where you bury the dead. Yes. And they would go and visit that, and they they would talk about it in different ways. But what was also interesting was the joie de vivre, the way that people seem to kind of not resent their way of living. They just love the camp. They just wanted to stay there. I mean, some of them had the opportunities to go out, so they left, and then they said, I had to come back. I felt very homesick. I had to come back and be in the camp. So it was this type of living. But in reference to the tower, what I think Mats did very brilliantly is the structure of the buildings and the chronological structure of the film. And Mats, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the way that the little girl grows up. And the way that the story moves in generations as she goes up. So the vertical, but also the chronological and the structure and the time, the temporal in many ways becomes very interesting to look at from that perspective. But I want to emphasize to people that, it felt, you go and interview these people, it didn't, no one was talking about themselves as being, of course, the idea of victim and the idea of oppression and the idea of struggle comes through, but they just were continuing to exist. They continuing to get on with their lives. And this, I believe, is the strength of what Palestinians are, the strength of the Palestinians, because even in the West Bank, in the occupied territories of the West Bank and Gaza, and you have everyday obstacles to living normally in these spaces, and people just continue to live normally. And it's amazing. I don't know whether you've seen a film called The Present, which was shortlisted for the Oscars. And it's just exactly that, how the idea of managing, continuing, and so on. And it's different to the idea of sumud, steadfastness, that the liberation movement, the revolutionary movement was talking about. It's much more organic. It's much more related to just getting on with life. And you get a blow, you fall down, you stand up again. And this is, I think, in recent weeks, I think this has been very exciting to see the actions of agency and activism coming from the ground up.
Absolutely. Matt.
Comment one thing?
Sure.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Dina says. It's just what in my film, because you come as an outsider and people have this idea that it's this, very depressed people that are utterly oppressed and living in this very bad place, which has no space, no opportunities for jobs. it's and when you live in the camp, all those things are true, but at the same time, people live. You know, they joke, they have their coffees, they have their cigarettes, they have their pigeons, they have, you know, follow up their kids with homework, they, you know, make food, they, you know, they live this life as best, you know, as we all do, as best you can. And it's not, you know, just this depressed place, because people, that's what people expect. And you come back to Norway, oh, you lived in a refugee camp, wow, that must have been so hard. Yes, of course, a lot of people were depressed, and there were, you know, it's not just that people manage and are strong and they, you know, in despite of everything they manage. You know, people are people. They they have bad days and good days. But just this, what I wanted to have in the film was to show that at the same time, this is unjust, that people living in these cramped places, but it's also what people know as home and what they love, you know? So even if you leave the camp, people will go back to Lebanon to see their families, and they will be at home. So, and also a lot of the response from the film is exactly as, you know, all the details you notice, and people have this very strong connection to the camps themselves, because it's where they've grown up, it's where they have their families. So it's not only Palestine that brings these strong feelings of what was left behind, but also the camp itself, which is there now.
Yeah, it's a community. It's a vibrant, thriving community in spite of all the hardships.
Yes.
Mats, I also love how multidimensional the film is. You know, the soundscape is very layered. It's very rich. I love that, because you hear people talking, you hear the traffic, you hear the azan, and it actually sounds like the call to prayer, which was really nice. And then you have the stop motion animation for Wardi's daily life, and then the 2D animation for all the flashbacks. You've also used archival footage. You've used photographs in the film. If you could tell us about all of these different elements, why they were important to you, how they came to be included in the film, and how they came to fit together so perfectly.
Thank you. The sounds are, you know, they're the true sounds from the camp. So we went down, and I had a Lebanese sound recording guy. It was his first time in the camp. As a Lebanese, he wouldn't, you know, have this chance really to go. So everything that you hear in the film is the authentic sounds of the camp themselves. And that was just as, you know, that the camp should look like the camp, even if it's made with, you know, and puppets. It was the same for the sound, that I wanted it to be as authentic as possible, that this is actually the camp. The pictures that I used, the photographs, the archive footage, half of it's the same pictures that I grew up with seeing as a child when my mom worked in Lebanon. So she would come back after 3 or 6 months working there, and they would go on tours, you know, in the schools, and show slides showing what life is like in the Palestinian camps. So this was important for me personally as well to include, also as a homage to my mom, who taught me all these things. And the other half of the pictures is my friends' own personal pictures from their albums. So this also this authenticity, that this is you know, the real people's own albums and pictures, was important to me. It's, you know, the film is also a big thank you from me to you know, to my friends. So I also wanted to show exactly their history, and to include their photos. People also a lot of time like mention Waltz with Bashir, for example, as another film that's in the same kind of group as mine, where it ends with the actual footage of what happened in Sabra and Shatila. I wanted the people to have an emotional. I wanted to kind of to punch people in the stomach not at the end of the film, but during watching the film, that this is actual people, it's actual lives, it's true stories, and not just, you know, some animation film that's not connected to the real world. So I wanted to include the archive footage inside the film and not, for example, at the end of the film. The mix of techniques, it's in animation, it's a lot of things is just how you practically solve this, because it's a lot of work. And for the historical flashbacks, if I wanted to be true to how, you know, the Corniche looked in the 80s, or how did Palestine look in 1948, it was, you know, the precision of drawing things is quite different, and it's much closer to kind of, you can be really much more precise to being close to what it really looked like. So the drawings were that was one of the big reasons for choosing the drawings. I think it also makes it, I don't know, to make this division between what's like also kind of a portrait of the emotions of people when they think back to what happened. It was nice to change the technique, and the tactility of the present day and what it is world is very physical in a different sense. So to me, that's kind of reality. Yeah.
Thank you for that. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, particularly when you talk about memories and then you use the 2D animation for that. Memories are sometimes also kind of pictures in our head, right? So it fits very beautifully. Dina, my next question for you is actually something that you've already talked about, but you know, I just want to share some of this information with people, and then maybe you can comment further on this. But I wanted to talk about the host country, which is Lebanon in this case, and how they set up a lot of external controls on the camps as well. So Palestinians, for example, are banned from working in many sectors of the economy. 60% are unemployed. More than half of them live under the poverty line. There's a shortage of clean water, sanitation, drainage. Many people get electrocuted every year because of the tangled cables that we see in the film. So that's actually a safety issue. And I wanted to ask you what the relationship between the people in the camp and then the people outside of the camp. So Beirut is only 2.5 miles away. It's not that far away. But what is the relationship of the people living in the camp to what's happening outside their world?
I think, thanks for this question. It's a complicated question because I don't know what's happening right now, but the last time I visited was 2017. And I did my research for my book between 2007 and 2009. Now, basically, the relationship is a difficult relationship because it's a political relationship, and one has to understand why the Lebanese state has continued to impose restrictions. Sort of, simplistically speaking, it's a question of whether they wanted to give citizenship to the Palestinians and naturalize them, and then put or endanger the very precarious sectarian balance in Lebanon. Lebanon is made up of different sects, but the majority sects are the Shiites, the Sunnis, and the Maronites, the Christian Maronites. And it's even more complicated because of the political, political system there, which is based on a power sharing agreement. But obviously, the power sharing agreement, which was agreed in 1943, has never been implemented properly. So the Palestinians, there's been a decision, or we don't want to give them naturalization because, first of all, if we do that, then that might risk or endanger the sectarian demographic balance in Lebanon. But secondly, because if you naturalize them, then you kind of say, well, they will never return back. And of course, this is another problem, which is the question of the return and the right of return of the Palestinian refugees and Palestinians in the diaspora. So, it's almost like there are these different complex sets of questions that Lebanon needed to resolve. But coming back to your original question, which is the Palestinians' relationship with the camp, with the outside world. And of course, we should not forget that Lebanon has gone through a very long civil war, started in 1975, ended in 1990. And the Palestinians were implicated in that in different ways. So they were either allies of some factions and parties who were fighting other factions and parties. And of course, then we have the strongest Lebanese party currently, Hezbollah, which is, despite kind of being very supportive of Palestinians, it again imposes some particular controls. And we cannot forget 1988, where we had the camp wars, where the kind of almost like another civil war, but happening between some Lebanese factions or sects and the camps. So when I was interviewing people remembered that period of intense attacks on the camps in particular, rather than the overall Palestinian population in Lebanon. They remembered it as being an attack on the camps, on the Palestinians and the camps themselves. And loads of people were remembering that time as being a very, very difficult period in their lives. So to go back to your original question, which is the relationship remains complex, complicated. There are, as you mentioned, all the restrictions are still there, and again, supplies. We have to also, many of these Palestinians don't have documents to travel outside the country, so if they want to travel outside, they have to become political asylum seekers and so on. But this said, they do some people do go out of the camps, go and do their day jobs and come back. So this type of work happens because it's always there's always some type of work that people pay for, whether it's in construction, teaching, etc., and then they come back and live in the camps. But it's a very complex situation. I remember I did my master's degree on how the Lebanese government or the Lebanese state controlled the Palestinians. And I compared it with the way that Jordan controlled the Palestinians. It's a different relationship in both cases. And one has to understand the local histories and politics of each situation. Now, again, in Syria, it's also complicated because the Palestinians in the Yarmouk camp they were allowed to integrate in society and they were able to work outside, but they had, but when there were, again, political problems between the Syrian state and some Palestinian groups, the camps were targeted as well. And the camps were targeted as well in the recent war because of some, accusations that they were radicalized or that they had elements of the rebel movement, or the opposition movement against the Assad regime in the camps. So they have had a hard time. Many of them had to actually become refugees in Lebanon, and that also opened more problems. And I'm not sure whether people know about the Nahr al-Bared battle, which happened, I think, in 2008. I can't remember the exact date. Nahr al-Bared is another Palestinian camp in the north of Lebanon, near Tripoli. And there was a huge, there was a month-long armed battle between the Lebanese army and camp, some elements in the camp, because again, they accused them of being members of a radical or so-called extremist group that they were opposed to. So it's very complicated. I'm not sure we can answer the questions in this discussion.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. So my next two questions for Mats are, first of all, could you tell us a little bit more about your mom? She worked as a nurse in refugee camps and created this wonderful connection between you and the Palestinian people. So she just seems like this extraordinary woman. And I was just wondering if you could tell us a bit more about her. And then my second question is something that you mentioned also, but which I also noticed as I was watching the film, is that there's so much poetry in the film. And sometimes in heartbreaking ways. So for example, the family dog is allowed to stay on the land, but the family is not, they have to leave. Birds can fly freely across borders, yet people are caged. And how the refugees, generations of refugees in these camps were young at some point, but were never allowed to be children, to be carefree children. So there's all of these things, that are in the film that I found very beautiful and very poetic. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your writing process.
Okay, so I'll start with my mom then. She was a nurse, or she is a nurse still. So she was part of, and both my parents were part of the solidarity movement in Norway, so the Palestine Committee, and they worked in Lebanon. So they first established themselves, or went to the Middle East in 79, but they could not operate as the Palestine Committee in Lebanon during those years. So they made a medical wing, which is called Norway, which is the same like Dr. Mats Gilbert, for example. So when they work in Gaza, it's the same organization. It's Norway. So when they operated during the wars in Lebanon, they had to both work in the camps, but they also had to, not take part in the conflict. They would also have to treat Amal soldiers or other wounded people, not just the Palestinians. But I don't know. My mom was, she went to work in Lebanon then from 85, 86, 87, like 3 to 6 months each year, with 3 small children at home. So my father would take care of us. I don't know. It's this has been a large part of her life. She also then went on to work with the Beit Samud, that has one of the Palestinian NGOs that after Tel Zatar massacre in 76 set up this orphanage program where you could support, because a lot of children then lost their parents, so you could support a child. So this has been a big part also of the work in Norway. That my mom has been involved with, is having people have through this support system where you both support a child or different children, and you write, and you have a connection to this child. So yeah, so I mean, so my mom would tell me that in my life I could choose anything I wanted myself, except on the question of Palestine. So we went then in 1989 when I was 12. She worked at the Palestinian hospital in Cairo, in Heliopolis. So we stayed there for a year, and this was also my first visit then we went to Rafah, for example, and this was during the first Intifada, and to Jerusalem, and it really made such a strong impression on me. Going and seeing all these kids with the victory signs, on the street corners, and seeing for the first time both this beautiful place with this wonderful bread but also then seeing Israeli, as a 12, 13-year-old, seeing these Israeli soldiers and what was going on. So I mean, all these things made a deep impression on me. They would also do the solidarity movement, do these study trips So my first trip to Lebanon, I was like 19. So my mom would promise us when we were kids that, you know, when the war ended, we would go to Lebanon. So when I was 19, so that's in 86, 95, we went, and then the Syrians were still in Lebanon. Yeah, and I really wanted to experience more myself what it was like to, you know, not just to visit, but to live in Lebanon. So, yeah.
Wonderful. And about your writing process.
Yeah. Well, to be honest, I must pay tribute to everything that's beautiful in the film is not mine. It's everything belongs to Abu Hassan, my very good friend, and Bassam Adawi, his sister, and to Lutfi and Rosette, the parents of Abu Hassan. I know that. So everything that's gold in the film is from them, you know, what they would tell me and how they would express themselves and talk about their lives, the jokes they would do. So I wrote the script in Norway, and it was difficult because I was far away from Lebanon. So I would take the bus to Sweden, actually, to Helsingborg, and I would discuss the script, the story with Abu Hassan a lot during the writing process to get his feedback, to get more stories, to have better jokes, to have so everything, you know, it's my friends and what they say. About it was also very important for me because I felt, you know, I'm trying to describe something that's involving, you know, like Abu Hassan, my good friend, his family, you know, he lost his brother, for example, you know, people lost. And so it was also hard for me to make something that was, I was a bit scared of making this animated film, which is entertainment in a way, about people's lives, and to be as to pay as much respect and to the lived experiences of people, that it was right and that it felt right to them how I portrayed both their lives in the camp and history. So I went back to Lebanon, and I would discuss the script also with different friends, and also with older people that know the history very well and know the camps very well, and get their feedback if I was on a good track with what I was making. Yeah. Of course, it's difficult to imagine when you're just reading a script and how it will actually be when it's a finished film. So, but yeah. So all this was very important for me during the writing process, actually.
Yeah, we can see that. We can feel that in the film, that it was important to you. It comes through.
Yeah. The biggest, when I showed the film in the camps in Lebanon, the one of the main things that people that were, they, you know, they love the film, a lot of people, but one thing is like the swearing that's in the in the film, which people, I've, you know, because the people also maybe perhaps felt shy to show the world the reality of this part, which is not something you perhaps want to show, but it's there. Yeah, and like, oh, we don't call our children hayawan, which is animals, but some people do in the you know, and yeah, so it's yeah.
Thank you. And then my last question before we open it up for Q&A is to both of you. If you want to tell us a little bit about the projects that you're working on right now, that would be great.
Dina, you want to?
Dina, if you're working on a new project.
Well, I am doing a follow-up to the first book, What It Means to Be Palestinian, because I ended that book in 1993. So it's a collection of personal stories and remembering before 1948 up to 93, which is the Oslo Agreement. And I think it's important to continue the story because there are, you know, people, what we call the Oslo generation, that period of time, opening up, not opening up. Then you have the 2000s and a lot of events happening. 2007, where you had the rift between Hamas and Fatah. And then you have up to now, you know, the last attacks in May. So I do hope that I can manage to capture enough, enough of these remembered or feelings of these remembered experiences, and to kind of emphasize the point that 1948 hasn't ended. What we call as the Nakba continues. Nakba meaning the catastrophe and the kind of the suffering and the struggle of the Palestinians, and to try and keep the story open. So I'm looking forward to doing that. But with COVID, it's been a little bit on the back burner, because you can do interviews and see people by Zoom. It's not like being in their home and spending hours with them. And you don't, you need to get the feeling to be able to make it into a book.
Mm.
That makes sense. And Mats, are you working on a new project?
Yes, it's little bit the same with the COVID situation here, that I'm a bit stuck in my house. But I've been working. Since I was very young, I'm also been working in NGOs with climate questions and as an activist since I was 12. So environmental issues are also something that I'm very concerned about, and that I would like to make something in what I know, which is animation. So it's we're trying to see if it's possible to make something to put focus on what has happened in the Niger Delta in Nigeria, where they found oil in the 50s, and they have completely destroyed so much of this like spectacularly beautiful, like this most beautiful place on earth, with this this like same as the oil spill from the Exxon Valdez. Like this has been going on, and just oil spilled right into the rivers for the last 70 years. So it's I would love to see if it's possible to make a film about this. And this is all done by Exxon, by Shell, American, French, British, Dutch companies. But I would like to find a human story, kind of like in The Tower, but using what has happened in history and today in the Delta as a mix of fiction and reality. Yeah, that's what I want to do. But it's difficult. I have never been to Nigeria. I lived in Tanzania when I was young. So I have to experience it, and to go there and to meet people and to feel what it's like as well. It's hard to sit here and write. Yeah.
That sounds good. Thank you. So with that, I think we're ready to open it up to the audience. And Link, if we have any questions, please.
Sure. Okay. Right now, we don't have any questions yet, but I hope we will have some questions soon. Folks, just as a reminder, you can send an email to questions@rw4p.org. You can raise your Zoom hand, and I will notice that and invite you to unmute yourselves. Or you can press *9 if you're on your phone, and that's the equivalent of raising your hand. So questions, please. Okay, Peter and Sarah Peters. So you should have there you go. Question.
Thank you so very much. A powerful presentation. Really appreciate that. And I have a question for Max. I'd also like to have Nina's comments on it as well. Max, one of the things that impressed me about the movie was the incredible way in which there was a universal appeal to that movie. You really touched the core of what human beings are about in their search for hope. And the tragedy of trying to find hope when you're not allowed to be in your own land. That has enormous appeal. And what I struggle with as I think about that kind of universality is, at the same time, you raise the question of identity. And part of what we're witnessing in the United States is some of the fractiousness of identity politics. And so somehow you were able to pull me into the universality of the story, the need for identity. And I'm wondering if any of that sort of conflict between identity and universality cropped up in your own thinking as you were putting the storyline together.
Not, I don't know. I'm not that intellectually. I think Dina will have to help me out on those parts. I don't know. I wanted to show in the film just how important this. Everybody I talk to talk about how important being Palestinian is. Kind of drinking Palestine from the mother's milk is and from the day they're born, everything around them in the camp and everything they see and everything that's part of their life is, even if they live in Lebanon, it's because they have been kicked out of Palestine X number of years ago. And I'm not sure if I'm answering your question here, but to me it was very, as a Norwegian coming from the outside and not having experienced anything of this history at all, it was still at the same time as a human being, I felt it was always easy to connect as just another human being.
Exactly.
To hear and to feel, and this everything, the layer that's inside people. So like when they would have these moments of silence, and where you felt all the emotions people have when it comes, when what they're experiencing in their lives now and what they have gone through. With the Palestinians, I always felt this was really this connection between me and my friends. I wouldn't say easy to understand, but people are very emotional. So this comes across. You really feel people's emotions deeply. It's so this was important things for me to get through in the film. About identity as Palestinians, what this frustration people had was really just, please, I just want my kids to get to school. I just really want a job. I just really want to be able to marry who I want. I just really want to travel. And all these things were just as a human being to have some chance in life to live a happy life. And then the question of Palestine was, as people, the backbone of who people are. And this is my interpretation, is really important as people, when you stand up straight and like, who are you? This is your identity as a Palestinian and your history. But people just wanted, to live, and because they were human beings, and so this. I don't know if you can talk more about this, Dina, but this longing for the return and this right to return, which is part of being Palestinian, and you're right, is one thing. But on the other hand, people just want to live. They just want to have a decent life. So I think the universality and this identity thing, you have to help me out, Dina.
I think you have answered it pretty well, but thank you for your question, Peter. The issue here is, I think Edward Said, the famous Palestinian, the late Edward Said, has written a very fantastic book called After the Last Sky, which is a book that was published in 1988, I think, with photographer with lots of photographs. So it's about what it means, in it he grapples with this concept, the humanism as something that unites everyone, as being universal, to be human, and the humanism around it, and the way that he was trying to tell us to speak about Palestine and about the Palestinians in this humanist voice, in the voice of humanism. But of course, you have the tensions with the individualism all the time. You cannot negate that; it's always there, and it's a question of whether, by as Matt has done, by kind of putting across the humanist vision and a humanist approach to understanding what it means to be Palestinian, is that a better way than constantly talking about the particularism or about the Palestinian identity as being different or as being exceptional or as being to anything else? So I think the notion of humanism does appeal to the outside world, very much like the language of human rights, climate change, and so on. It's something we all relate to, and it might be the best way to talk about Palestine and the Palestinians. And we are seeing loads of examples of using this language, the humanism language, in creative ways by ordinary Palestinians, by non-ordinary Palestinians in different ways. So, yeah, and it's always a tension there with identity politics.
Mm.
One comment is how the animation works. I felt, when we screen the film to a Norwegian audience, they will relate to because it's puppets. I think it's easier for people to relate to Wardi as, it could be their sister or their daughter or granddaughter, because it's a puppet. It's not this real Palestinian girl that lives somewhere far off, and that's not really your history. But when it's in a puppet and animation form, people connect very. It's a strange thing, but they connect perhaps more with, this could be my daughter. This person in the film could be my sister. So that's something that, when we screen the film, or if it's Syrian people that come from Syria now that relate to the film, the way that this could be their story. When you see the bombs falling in the film, they feel, or they tell me, I really felt that this film was my story as well, that there's so many things that are similar. And since it's an animation, it's you fill that space of when you have this abstract puppet. So you fill that space with your own thoughts and emotions in a way, if that makes
Interesting.
sense. Yeah.
Interesting. Matt, I remember you saying a few minutes ago that people just want to live their life. And it reminded me of a theme that it mentioned several times, I think, in the movie, where there was a sister who was leaving to get married, and she was moving out.
Yeah.
And, yeah. So I see we have another
Marilyn has a question.
Marilyn, I see a question from Dick and Beth Myers.
Yeah, but Marilyn is holding her hand up. She wants.
Oh, she does. Okay, well, thank you. Okay, Marilyn, let me add. Okay, why don't you go ahead, Marilyn? You should be able to unmute yourself now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. First, I want to thank Mara and Dr. Dina and Matt for bringing this all together. And Dr. Dina for mentioning how people want to continue to exist. It's so painful. It's so great, the pain. It's like you can't even think about it. And yet it's a film you can show in school. So Matt, that is wonderful how you could do such a thing as this. And what I wanted to mention is that at the end, when the pigeons carry Sadie to the moon or to home or to heaven, and giving the key to Weddy, the granddaughter, and Hope, there's always hope. And you portrayed it so well, because we can say the pain is so great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marilyn. Okay. So Dick and Beth Myers, please, you can unmute yourselves.
Thank you so much for this beautiful film. This animation with the mixed media really makes it special. And I wanted to mention a special scene before I asked my question. The scene is the family by a campfire outside their house, where there's just the 4 people in the family. It's just so touching that they had this beautiful experience, that they could always remember something good in the past of their life. And it makes them, as we're saying, so human and real. And probably I can relate, because I've had experiences like that too. The question I had was about the scene where the 2 boys are playing and making up a little village and stuff. The dialogue was so real. And I want to ask you, was that really true, that was just taped from real children playing, or was that all set up?
Thank you. This scene was recorded with Palestinian kids actually in Sweden, living in Sweden. So they didn't themselves experience this, but we made them play together in the recording studio. And then after a while, they kind of forgot that they were, being recorded. So I really wanted to have this authentic, and so they don't follow really the script. We would help them to, okay, these are the themes you should talk about, and try to get some parts of what I had written into their game. This is an interesting story, because this is a story that Abu Hassan would tell me about how he was playing with his friend at that time, who was Bilal, and this is a real story. And Bilal survived in real life, and he was taken with the English doctor to England and treated, and he ended up in Denmark actually. So he's alive, and his family is in Lebanon, and he's living in Denmark. I don't know him personally, but it was interesting, because Abu Hassan tells me this story from his childhood. But I've also heard this story from other people in the camp. So it's a story that people feel. So I think maybe more people will tell this story as they have experienced it themselves. So I'm not sure actually if Abu Hassan was there with his friend, or if Bilal was a friend of his and he heard his story. But in Abu Hassan's, when he tells me this story, this happened in this way, and he feels it this way, that he was playing with Bilal. But I think a lot of kids that generation will tell you that story, and that they also were there. So it's this kind of a collective story, that something that happened that I think to Abu Hassan would describe a lot about how he felt and things that happened in those years. And also Abu Hassan, I mean, I think he adds to the story. I think some parts he have made up when he's telling about this game and how they were building a life and they were building a future, and then this shot comes and their future is shattered. So when he tells me the story, he continues it, and he makes perhaps something up. He adds something and makes it his. So it's and he tells it both in a poetic way and a beautiful way to me, which makes me included in the film. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Still waiting for some questions. If anyone has a question. Marilyn, I can see your hand now. So let's get you unmuted. There we go.
I am back again. I just wanted to also mention the architect with the ladders, the way Mara explained it, and of course Matt portrayed it. The building is only going up. You can only build up. And you wonder, for 4 generations, how many more generations can you continue to build up? And we saw how difficult it was to get up to see Pigeon Boy, because the ladders were going higher and higher. So I don't know if there's any comment, but I thought that was so well done. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you. it's the, yeah. I was, people, when they ask me about the all the symbols that are in the film, which is the key, the pigeons, the nature, the flowers on the rooftops, and how I invented it, because I didn't invent anything. All this is there, in the camps. This is the camp. It's very visible. All the signs, all the graffiti, everything. It's not something you have to search for. It's what's there. So it's and the key, of course. So all this is the reality of the camp, and not just something I made up. Yeah. And it's homing pigeons, and it's not peace pigeons. Yeah.
Right. I think Elaine Johnson is waiting to ask a question now too.
Thank you, you two, for this this wonderful film. I was really taken by, at the beginning of the film, the little girl coming home from school, walking into the camp with its narrow alleys and ducking under the wires, and going past all of the things that an observer such as myself would say, oh my goodness, what a terrible situation. She was skipping, playing hopscotch. She was smiling, seemingly not at all negatively affected by this environment, because, as you say, Mats, this is home. And so what I'm wondering is, for the year that you lived there, I have to believe that there must have been an atmosphere also of rejection of or disdain for the ways in which they're forced to live because they have no choice, and how that may or may not affect the general environment. And perhaps they don't. So tell me about that.
I think, like Abu Hassan would explain to me that, it costs a lot to be angry, and it costs a lot to be sad. That's really hard to spend your life. Like you said, we cannot just sit down and be depressed and sad all the time. It's it doesn't work. So like, we have to make jokes. We have to sit on the roof and drink our coffee and have this life as good as we can. But you feel like in the scene with Pigeon Boy, this small moments of where he looks out and you hear the mosque, and you understand that, and this is really, really how it is. And I felt that you have these small moments where nothing is said, and you feel, you get a slight glimpse or understanding of what life really must be like, to not have a job, to not see your brother that went to Germany illegally and cannot come back to his father's funeral, or all these things that are just terrible. You cannot marry because you don't have any money, everything or you don't have work, and you're forced to be taken care of by your sister. All these things that are, so it's but really, I would know very few people that would spend their time complaining. People would talk about normal things as much as they could. Resentment towards Israel, never. Really, this might sound strange, but people really don't. Israel's far away, and it's not something people, at least when I lived in the camp in 2001 too, even if at that time also things were happening in Israel. It was the my dement brain.
Second Intifada.
second intifada, and you had a lot of very bad things happening inside Israel. So it was an opportunity where you would expect people to talk badly about Israel. What they would say is just, we just want to come back. Mm-hmm. That's all. Mm-hmm. And we understand, this thing that you come and you take a country, okay. Or not okay, but, you could understand it. Okay, you want this place, you take it and you kick somebody out. But we just want to come back and live as well. But Israel was really not talked about much. People, when they talk about resentment, it's more towards being let down by their Arab, other Arab countries. That's really, really, really something people feel resentful about. How I experienced it, that they are let down by their Arab brothers and sisters.
I must say that I had the same experience. I interviewed 100 people, so quite a lot of people, and there was no mention that much of Israel, but it's a kind of exasperation with everyday life that sometimes we're tired. We would rather. There was only one person who said, "I'm fed up with the whole thing. I just would love to take my kids to have a better life in Sweden." Of all places. So that was never talked about.
Yeah, and also in my film, it was important to have this because that it's not about about the Palestinian lives and the Palestinian experiences living in the camps all these years, and it's not about. I wanted to exclude the Israelis, to not have this. It's a film about the Palestinians, and I wanted to try to be like a mouthpiece for what I had been told living in the camp, and it's not about hating Israel at all. It's it's also so when we show the film in schools, for example, it's not about showing how bad the Israelis are. It's just about trying to show people that these are human beings with the right to have, to come back to their homes if that's what they want, and to be shown, decency, respect, and, given the right to just live. Yeah.
So, Link, if we don't have any other questions, maybe we can wrap up. What do you think?
I think that sounds like a good idea.
Okay,
so,
very good.
Yeah.
So, thank you once again, Mats and Dina, so much for talking to us and also for the wonderful work that you're doing. Thank you for that. And thank you everyone for joining us today and for attending. Hope to see you next year for more films and more discussions with the Witness Palestine Film Festival. And I just wanted to say to end that I just wanted to remind everyone that UNRWA, which is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, provides a lot of the humanitarian assistance to these camps that we see in the film. It also supports over 5 million people in Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon by providing education, healthcare, social services. The US used to be the agency's largest single donor, but it cut its contributions from 360 million to 60 million in 2018, and then seized all funding in 2019. The Biden administration has restored some of that funding, but it's nowhere near where it needs to be. So that's something for us to push for here in the US, along with halting all military aid to Israel. And of course, BDS, which is boycott, divestment, and sanctions on Israel until Palestine is free. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mara. That was brilliant.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.